So, for context, Elizabethan Jacobean period, ordinary fellas. So what about everybody else? Largely, this splits into three groups. We've got the gentry, who are the super rich. We would refer to them by the 1700s as the landed aristocracy. So those are the people who own big swathes of land. That's theirs. That's how they get their money. They charge rent for people to live on it. They technically own all the stuff that's grown on it and made on it, and they can sell it and buy it and trade it and whatever. So they're pretty well off. Live in enormous houses. I should have a picture here. Many stories, like we're talking 4 to 7, basements, cellars, attics, different wings. They're generally made out of brick. They have loads of windows. Glass is really expensive, so most people don't have that. They have an incredibly rich and varied diet. The wealthiest people would have sugar. But say, for example, you're a wealthy landowner and you have a banquet. Everybody comes, they eat your swan and pike and all of that stuff and everything else. And maybe you've got a tomato on the table to show how wealthy you are. Or maybe even a banana. Very exciting. But then your very, very specialist guests would head off into a separate room to have a sugar banquet because you wouldn't have enough to feed everybody. And it was seen as a really, really high status thing. So that's your gentry. They're having a good time, pretty much whatever, unless they get more money from the wool trade, in which case they might struggle a little bit. Your middling sort, that's sort of your middle classes. That's your not your labourers, but your farmers. So people who own their own bit of land. They're yeoman farmers, they're husbandman farmers. They maybe have orchards, they have animals, they have crops. They grow a lot, not just subsistence, and they sell that to people. So largely that's your middling sort. Some of your tradespeople would be in there too, perhaps if they were really good at it. So your carpenters, your merchants, your traders, again, would be in your middling sort. And these people would live in 2-story houses because you can now build an oak frame. There's loads of money around because there's been loads of plague. So there's only, in the Elizabethan period, there's still only about 6-7 million people in England. So there's quite a lot of land, quite a lot of space, quite a lot of money to go around. So your middling sort really start to rise up in this time period, make quite a lot of money. And they have access to quite a few of the things that the gentry have, but probably less often. So they would have sugar for birthday cakes, but not all the time. And they would have access to kind of good fruits, good vegetables, perhaps wine and stuff for special occasions, a lot of mead. And then, of course, you've got your labouring poor. So your labouring poor basically live in what would be one-room places that people had lived in since the Anglo-Saxon period and the Celts before that. They're like wattle and daub walls and straw tops and a hole where the smoke goes out, whereas your gentry house would have loads of chimneys. Your middling sort would probably have one. Your labouring poor really just has to have that hole. Your labouring poor would have no glass window, definitely. They might have some gaps windows, but they'd be shutters. Your middling sort is quite like to have windows on the front and shutters on the back, so that you can show that you're wealthy enough to have glass, but you don't actually have to spend enough to buy glass for all of your windows. I've talked a little bit already about the difference between Protestants and Catholics, and this might not feel like a big difference because in my lovely head, in 21st century world, it doesn't really matter what religion you are. That's nice, isn't it? But for most people, in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, it's probably the case, unless, of course, your life's been made really difficult by whoever's in charge. And most of the time, that person was a Protestant, so it becomes quite difficult for Catholics. So there would have been, I should think, person-to-person difficulties, prejudice, persecution, because they're seen as making life more difficult. And this persecution and instability is also what feeds into the witchcraft trials and the witchcraft crazes. So, for example, many Catholics would have to worship privately. A lot of Catholic practices, things like believing that the bread and the wine really turn into the body and blood of Jesus, and burning of incense. If you're doing those things privately because you're forced to hide what you're doing, then it can look quite suspicious, and that can lead to accusations of witchcraft. So that, combined with James I's book, Demonology, combined with bad harvests, combined with eventually the kind of beginnings of the English Civil War, and the fact that people could profit from it hugely. So Matthew Hopkins was known as the witch finder general. He got paid for finding witches per witch, which is a bit of an encouragement to find lots and lots and lots of them. And people accused each other because they were upset with each other. They had fallen out with their neighbour, so they'd accuse their neighbour of something. They thought it might protect them if they accused somebody else. And that was a myth that was perpetuated really by the witch finders, who were saying, you know, if you tell us who the other ones are, then maybe you'll be okay. But they weren't. So there's huge amounts of poverty in the Elizabethan period, and the gap between rich and poor is also starting to get much, much bigger. So by the time we've got to Jacobean England, but Elizabethan England as well, England is one of the richest countries in the world, and it still has huge numbers of people who are subsistence farmers, so they're labouring poor, or they're living in poverty, and you get massive increase in poverty, again, because of bad harvest, because of increasing prices, because of inflation, because of the decline of the wool trade. Oh, here's an interesting thing. So Elizabeth actually tried to encourage growth in the wool market again by making it illegal for Elizabethan Englishmen to go around without a hat on. So they had to buy a hat to wear because it was illegal not to. It didn't last very long. It was only a very short period of time where this was a law. But it's like a baker boy hat, so they're made out of wool or wool fabric. And there's quite a lot of fabric involved. So she was hoping, or their government was hoping, that it would stimulate growth in the wool trade. It didn't really work. But the fashion for men wearing hats caught on, and that stayed for a really, really long time. There's obviously also explorers, so you've got people like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, Humphrey Gilbert, Ralph Fitch, James Lancaster, who go to America, who go to India, and who find loads of stuff and bring it back, and again help that middling sort and the wealthy to get even wealthier. Lots of popular pastimes like bare knuckle boxing or bear baiting, which are illegal now but weren't then, and a lot of them used to take place, and people would bet on them in the theatres, like after plays or when plays weren't on, in the pit where the ordinary people would stand. And of course, theatre is massive in the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods. You've got the Shakespeare, you know that's why you're watching. Lots of outbreaks of plague throughout both of these time periods, which of course closes theatres down. But lots of tension around theatres anyway. I mean, it's really good because it's pretty much the only popular pastime that technically everybody could access. If you could get somewhere where there's a theatre, you could afford to go in, you could see that play, and it was fun. People throw stuff, people swore, people had a good time. You had poor people at the bottom, they're known as penny stinkers or groundlings, and then rich people at the top who'd have like cushions and nice stuff, and quite a lot of prostitution around too, obviously. As well as that, you've got secular music for the first time. So music largely was going to be in the church before this time, but you're getting some secular music through. Poetry, loads of people in poetry, people like Edmund Spenser. So a really big upshot in culture. And this is why this period is often referred to as the Golden Age. But the problem being there's a lot of resistance from Puritans, and there are a few Puritans in Elizabeth's Privy Council and Parliament. And Sir Francis Walsingham and William Cecil are both Puritans, and they really, really push this narrative. So although the Privy Council as a whole is very happy for theatres to happen because it brings in money, Puritans thought that theatre was bad because it encouraged crime. So London authorities didn't like it either because it encouraged crime, because it encouraged drinking, because it encouraged people to do that and then have time off work because they hurt themselves, and they also thought it encouraged promiscuity and sex before marriage, and therefore children with unmarried parents, which if you're a Puritan, it's like the worst thing in the world. But there is a decline in those things, but those things do still live on into the next kind of time periods as well, particularly written word, because you've got the printing press being invented in the Tudor period as well. So the amount of people who are reading increases quite rapidly through this time period. The amount of people who are understanding different language in this time period because they're accessing those things. So we see a massive increase in literacy even before we get to industrial period and education being compulsory. And finally, so all these aspects combined, there would be no decline in the wool trade without exploration and travel and needing cotton instead. And for cotton being easier to clean and lighter, just as there wouldn't be smuggling or highway robbery or the large increase in crime. Loads of smuggling and highway robbery in the Elizabethan period and Jacobean because there's access to those things from around the world. There would be no increase in the accusation of witchcraft without religious upheaval and poverty. There would be no theatre if the Puritans had their way. And at the same time, their actions, the religious strife, the poverty, all of it gave inspiration to the playwrights, poets, musicians, and artists of the time. Thanks.